we should properly arm Ukraine, and at the moment, Ukraine is fighting Russia with one hand tied behind its back. Principally, there is a serious problem inside the Biden White House. Effectively, in simple, plain language, Putin is a bully and Biden is afraid of him. And that is not good for the whole Western world, not good for the United States of America, and not at all good for Ukraine. But this big bomb, let me try and explain to the viewers and listeners what it is, because I've come across these things in Chechnya in 2000, went undercover to Chechnya in February 2000, before Vladimir Putin had won his election. So what happened was we got to this village. I think it was on the Chechnya, on the edge of it, and it had been hit by a fuel air bomb, a vacuum bomb, a thermobaric bomb. What this means, as I understand it, and I'm not a train spotter, nor am I a tank spotter, and sometimes I get this wrong. But there was an old Chechen guy, the father of the family, and he was on crutches, and there was some rubble, but actually quite a few buildings were intact, but the windows had gone. And he said that he'd lost 18 members of his family with one of these fuel air bombs, let's call it that. And essentially, to understand what happens, there's a two-stage release. As a big bomb comes down, and around about 200 feet above ground level, it explodes with a small detonation, but releases an enormous cloud of petroleum jelly or petroleum goo, which then there is a secondary explosion that ignites, and it sucks all the oxygen for a long way around into itself. And now this killed 18 members of his family, but actually kept buildings more or less intact. Windows were shattered, but the bricks and masonry were there. So it's a slightly weird effect. What it does to human beings, Jonathan, is it sucks. There is the blast. The blast is huge, like it's a blast bomb. So if you're caught in the middle of it, you're blasted to bits, and your head, the whole thing gone. If you're on the edge of it, there is this terrible whoosh of air feeding the explosion, sucking the air in, sucking oxygen in, and people's lungs are sucked inside out. Or the gas flame, the gas ball, burns people's lungs. So it's a truly horrible method of war. It's been banned against civilians. And if they hit Vovchansk, and I've been there, 22, in the autumn of 22, there will be, as there always is in these war zones, old people, often old ladies, who buried their husband in the local cemetery, and I've heard it myself, and more than once. I'm not leaving because my fella is in that cemetery down there, and I'm not leaving him. So it's very likely that the Russians committed a war crime here. By the way, so this weapon is okay against soldiers, but it is, in my mind, barbaric. And we've got to meet Russian fascism with sufficient force to expel it from Ukraine. And the problem is that whatever the rhetoric that's coming from the West, the delivery is really, really quite different. The delivery is poor. And why is the delivery poor? Essentially, because the Biden White House, and the problem is there is no other support of Ukraine with anything like the amount of military power that the United States has got, that they're afraid of Ukrainian victory leading to Putin's humiliation, Putin's end, end in power, which almost certainly means end. And then that is followed by Russian chaos. And the particular problem for Biden, well, there are two problems here. First of all, he is a child of the Cold War. He grew up with the threat of nuclear annihilation rested over all of us. He's very, very worried about that. Too worried, in fact. And I'll go into the reasons why, but I'm setting out the problem first. The second thing is that Iraq scarred the United States deeply. It was a terrible geostrategic mistake. And what happened was, by getting rid of Saddam, they unlocked the Pandora's box of horrors. Principally, the majority population in Iraq is Shia, one of the two halves, if you like, of Islam. And the Shia, although they're Arabs, their brothers in religion, or brothers and sisters in religion, are in Iran. And so effectively, you've had something like an Iranian takeover of Iraq. Not quite, but something like that. And you had a government and a country that hates the United States next door, helping Iraqis subvert the American occupation. And this caused an enormous amount of grief for America. And they squandered trillions of dollars on not achieving stability in Iraq. And the stability that's there is it is now more of a colony of Tehran than it is of Washington, D.C. So they are terrified, Biden in particular, of Russia turning into Iraq 2.0. They never say this. It's never articulated. But there is a massive problem with the policy. Now, look what Israel is doing right now. And by the way, I believe in a two-state solution. I believe that Netanyahu is one of the driving forces of Netanyahu's behavior is that the more he bombs the Palestinians and now Hezbollah and now the Iranians, the more his ratings will rise, the less chance he has of going to jail. I also understand that Israel needs to and has to defend itself in an appropriate way. But I'm also conscious, having been an old war reporter, that there are armies and countries that defend themselves in an appropriate way, and then there are some countries who overdo it. And I would point the finger at Israel and Netanyahu right now. But I have to say that Israel has sent a message: don't fuck with us, and people get it. And the problem is, Ukraine doesn't have Israel's firepower. And also, there is a big difference between Hezbollah, for example, and Russia. So the person who needs the will to fight Russia or to help Ukraine fight Russia is the president of the United States. At the moment, that's Joe Biden. And he's afraid of Putin. So there's this awful timidity. And the problem is, it's kind of a situation where you're being bullied at school and you see a teacher, big, strong teacher walking by, help me. And the big teacher ignores you and carries on, and the bully carries on hitting you. That's what's happening in Vovchansk. You've got to understand that the Soviet Union was, for most of its time, an evil dictatorship. And towards the end, as the machinery, or the human machinery, if you like that metaphor, became more and more gerontocratic, got older and more feeble, it became less bad. Under Stalin, it was a dictatorship, very little different from Nazi Germany, apart from the anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. But before the Holocaust happened, you would be hard put to say which was worse. You might well say that Stalinism was worse than Nazism. The Holocaust makes puts Nazi Germany in a darker place, far darker, the worst government in history, in modern times, or in modern history, and the darkest. But this, the shadow, the Soviet shadow, casts kind of long gloom over Russia and Ukraine too. And I can talk about some of those, the failings of Ukraine to deal, to open up the shutters to get the light in. It's a serious problem. But in Russia, it, the Soviet shadows are very, very long indeed, and very, very dark. And Putin, I mean, in Moscow there is a metro station with a bit of a homage to Stalin. You know, it's not a big thing, but it's there. And there's nothing like that to Hitler in any single German metro station in Berlin. Not at all. Of course there isn't. Why is there in Moscow? Because of double standards, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was never a kind of de-Stalinization program like there was in West Germany. Now, listen, it wasn't perfect by any means, but it was an attempt to denazify, and that attempt was never made by central government, ever. Although there was a loosening up, there wasn't a proper attack. So you've got these Soviet shadows, and remember, you know, under the Tsars, until they lost the Crimean War, until the Russians lost the Crimean War, the vast majority of the population were not free; they were serfs. Slav is, I think the etymology is correct, is the base word for slave. So you've got a kind of, in Russia, you've got a slave state, and the problem, and this is a White House problem, but it's also true in Berlin and Paris and London, to a lesser degree perhaps. But you have a problem of understanding the nature of those long Soviet shadows in Moscow. And because of this, and they project Western tropes, Western structures, Western thinking onto this barbarous, still more or less Stalinist mindset. My friend Andrei Soldatov, who, by the way, whose father is seriously ill, he's dying, and he's been locked up in prison in Moscow. Andrei and his partner Irina, who are great friends of mine, live in exile in London. And what's happening is the Russian state is torturing his elderly father, who, by the way, was the main Russian internet pioneer. He was the guy who helped build the Russian internet. And what they're doing, they're torturing this old man. But he once said to me, for the Panorama I made in 2018, taking on Putin, he said, we're all still afraid of Stalin's secret police. And the problem that Biden and the people around him have got, Jake Sullivan, his hopeless and hapless national security advisor, so they don't get that. They're not talking, when they're thinking of how Russians think, they don't understand that this long Soviet shadow still rests on their hearts. And they don't understand that ordinary Russians are more or less hostages, captives, who are not free to speak their own mind. Who I once asked a Chechen woman who was 8 when her whole family were blown to bits by a Russian bomb, and I caught up with her years later, and I said, for my book Killer in the Kremlin, I said, "Are you afraid to speak?" She said, "No, we're afraid to breathe." And Biden doesn't get that. What you're dealing with is a nation which has been captured by its intelligence agency. So it's like MI6 taking over the whole of Britain. And by the way, for any lunatics out there, I just want to point out a couple of simple things. Yeah, I've got some friends who used to be in MI6, people like Christopher Steele, Arthur Snell, but they're really good people and they're funny. their politics are not conservative. I'll put it just like that. But they don't run the country, and they didn't run the country when they were in that organization, or nothing like it. For example, it's way too small. The KGB slash FSB, as it's now called, back in Stalin's day, it was called the GPU, the GPU, or the NKVD. There are a number of names. But this is an intelligence agency which essentially has captured a regime and then has captured the country. And there is no, the ideology of communism, that's long dead. And what you've got is a vicious, selfish criminality. But this isn't straight gangsterism. It is gangsterism with what they like to say is with epaulets on, or it's gangsterism where the big gangsters wear uniforms, and the most common uniform is a general in the KGB. And that is, by the way, there's an air raid siren just going off right now. I never hit a shelter out of, there is a bottle of rather nice Italian red in front of me if things go bad. So I'll just carry on. But it gives you a flavor of what's life here. So there is a failure. Biden doesn't quite get what he's dealing with, and Scholz doesn't quite get what he's dealing with. And the problem is that while Putin is in power, he is an incredibly supple guy. A common question I get asked is, if Putin falls, won't his successor be worse? I said, well, no, because Putin is really cunning and really, really smart. Can you hear the air raid siren, by the way?
It's coming through very, very faintly.
Yeah, it's a shivery. It's a sound that makes me shiver. It goes up and down like a wave. But by the way, I'm just looking out the window, and people. There is the usual portrayal of extraordinary, beautiful women who seem to be walking a little bit quicker than normal. That's all that happens. Keep stance. But the Americans don't get it, or they're afraid of nuclear war, and they're afraid of Russian collapse leading to Russian chaos, leading to what? God knows what. The problem is you've got to deal with the bully in front of you, and you can't say, hey, if I actually stand up to this bully, then another bigger bully will come along. No, you can't do that. That's not how you survive primary school, in my experience. You just got to stand up to the bully and say, bugger off. And it may hurt you in the beginning, but it's the way to do it, to show you've got fight. Now, Zelensky came to Washington and he was humiliated by Donald Trump. We all saw that. But behind the scenes, he was humiliated by Biden too. And Biden's humiliation was crueler because superficially, on the surface, it's all lovey-dovey. But Zelensky was asking, can I use long-range rocket artillery, which you've given me, the ATACMS? Can the British, who've given us Storm Shadows, there are American components, and contractually, as I understand it, the British can't say to the Ukrainians, use our Storm Shadows, because there are too many American bits and bobs in the rockets. Can we please use them specifically against targets, rocket factory or rocket blast places where they're launching pads, so we're firing back at the Russian rockets before they kill our people? And the answer was no. And the answer is no, because Biden's afraid of nuclear war. Look at what the Chinese said. And they got into this. I was worried about nuclear war in September 22, and I was watching the Chinese. And the first Chinese official who said it very plainly was the deputy head of mission at the UN in China, the Chinese delegation to the UN in New York. And he said there should be no nuclear adventurism. Ukrainians don't have nukes. No nuclear adventurism is directed straight at Moscow. Then the Chinese foreign minister said it, same language. Then there was a Tyrant Tsars conference in Samarkand, and Xi said it himself. So the Chinese do not want the Russians to use the nuke at all, because that will cause the world economy to hit a massive depression, and China is worried about its economy. So Biden's fears are utterly misplaced. At the same time, he's got to understand that Trump is being supported by Putin in ways that we don't properly have got all the detail on, but that was certainly the finding of the intelligence community in America after the 2016 election, and it feels like exactly the same thing is happening right now. So if we don't stand up to the Russians, then our own societies and our own politics, our own democracies will be hollowed out by Russian alliances, the alliance of Russian dark money with the far right or the far left across the Western world. And that's happening. Tommy Robinson's been to Russia. Marie Le Pen borrowed from Russian banks. The AfD, thick with the Russians. Matteo Salvini, his consigliere, went to Moscow, had a conversation in the Metropole Hotel. That particular avenue of dark money was never acted upon, but was that the only one, or it's the only one we know about? I don't think so. So the problem is that the fear of Russian collapse undermines a far greater worry, fear of Western collapse, because it seems we don't have the will, the balls to defend ourselves properly. By the way, I'm always an optimist. Kamala is the vice president of the United States, but she used to work in McDonald's. What's that tell you? It tells you she's a fighter. And you saw her when she debated with Trump. You know, she went and shook his hands. She looked at him in the eye. He was scared of her. He didn't want to do that because she's beneath him. Well, I don't think so. But she's a fighter. And the moment she gets, I hope she wins. I hope and pray she wins. But the moment she gets in, what she's going to do is she's going to have to copy Elizabeth I at Tilbury Docks when she said, I have a heart, I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart of an English king. And Kamala's going to have to do something like that. And the first thing, I think the easiest way of her showing that she's different to Biden is sending, say, 20,000 Bradley armored personnel vehicles, which are gathering rust in the Arizona desert. You send those to the Ukraine. It's a simple, non-nuclear thing, but it will change the war very, very quickly. The ability of the Ukrainian army to look after its people better. You have all of that heavy metal going and lots of it. And then Putin looks at the stream of heavy metal and then says, okay, we'll do a deal. The Ukrainians can't sit down and do a deal with Putin because the Russians have raped too many people, castrated too many poor Ukrainian prisoners of war. They've tortured so many and they've stolen all these children. But there can be a kind of North Korea, South Korea kind of stop. And things are bleak here in Ukraine. That's true. People are depressed. They're not going to give up and they're not going to collapse. But it's certainly true to say that the expectations are way nothing like they were. In the autumn of 22, the Ukrainians had taken back Kyiv and Kharkiv and Kherson, and they were on the move. And there was going to be this great counteroffensive in the spring, and that failed badly. And then since then, Ukrainians have gone backwards. One exception is in Kursk, and what the Russians have done is poison the river there. So there's every creature in that river is now dead. And it feeds into the Dnipro. So that poison is going to infect the whole of Ukraine. And they're hammering Sumy, a city I was in August. So you're left with I think I'm an optimist if Kamala gets in. You can wipe this entire conversation if Trump gets in, because then everything that's optimistic becomes pessimistic very quickly. I don't think that Ukraine will collapse completely. I think the Europeans and the British will do their very best to help Ukraine. But if the American military aid is switched off, there will be a fresh, massive refugee crisis. There will be an awful lot of soul searching. And Trump, I think, is Putin's creature, and he will see Ukraine suffer if he gets in. Yeah, so I think there is a real plan B, and really the problem is they've never delivered on plan A, which is to give the Ukrainians the stuff they need in a timely fashion. So the Ukrainian soldiers I know were saying things like, "Hey, we we." By the way, the website was called Nude Africa. I remember now. The Ukrainians were never given enough stuff. Plan B is let the Russians sit on what they've got. Now, the problem is that if Biden persists, Biden's leaving in January, come what may. If Trump comes in, it's a disaster for Ukraine. If Kamala comes in, I think because she's a woman, she'll be under pressure to show her steel. And therefore, I'm a bit of an optimist that actually America will change its policy and deliver it. The problem is, of course, that the Chinese are watching. And at the moment, there is only one Western leader or leader in the West who is showing a lack of fear when trouncing his enemies, and that's Benjamin Netanyahu. And actually, I think he's overdoing it. And in the long term, he's making the West less secure because I think it very, very likely, and people like the former head of MI5, Lisa, what's her name, Manningham Buller, something like this, is saying, there are going to be terror attacks. I think that's a real possibility. But nevertheless, you've got a Netanyahu is saying to his enemies, don't you dare hit Israel. We have an ally in Ukraine, an ally that has been the victim of a pitiless and barbarous war, and we're still buying Russian oil and gas. We're still letting Russian money trade on the international money markets. We're still allowing Russian oligarchs to sue each other in the London courts. Our sanctions are more or less ineffective. We are not doing enough, and we need to do far, far more. And by the way, the reason I'm urging this is because I don't want, my son or my daughter to have to join the British Army to go to war against Russia. I don't want that to happen. I think the problem with Britain is because we were hit by COVID, and then we did Brexit, and the two things have given a massive hit to the British economy, and we don't have the money, or we have a Labour Chancellor who is frightened of spending the money because of the reaction of the bond markets, and doesn't seem to be able to plan her way out of this mess. So that's scary too. But we need to do this, because if we don't, things will be far worse. If Trump gets in, we'll see this refugee crisis be awful, and also we'll see a rise not just in Russian adventurism but Chinese adventurism as well. So the very thing that Trump always says he's most afraid of is the rise of China is facilitated by helping Russia, because Russia and China are their allies. I'm in this city, just the other day, Shahed drones were fired at this place. They were knocked out of the sky by the Ukrainians. Well done, terrific. But they're made in Iran. Some of the rockets and some of the ammunition that comes here fired by the Russians at the Ukrainians comes from North Korea. So you do have an axis of evil. It is true. They do talk to each other, and it turns out that China and Iran and North Korea have been far better allies to the Kremlin than the United States and Germany and France and Britain has been to Ukraine. And and the problem with it, this is kind of the game. And who are the losers in this game? Well, the Ukrainians. I mean, in the summer, I went to a town in the center of Ukraine, which is a city, which is the home of Ukrainian Special Forces. And a year ago, there was a line of squares, and on each face of the square, there was a face of a dead Ukrainian soldier. And now those squares, they have gone across the road, and there's a whole new line, but they're not squares, they're octagons. Ukraine is bleeding to death, both in terms of people, soldiers, money, everything, because this war grinds on. Putin doesn't care about the dead. So it's desperate. And what's happening as the bully monsters, the victim, the big people with the big power in the West are afraid to turn up to the bully and say, stop this, or you're in trouble. And it's a colossal fight. Jonathan, it feels like we're back in 1938. People like you and me saying, we've got to stand up to Hitler. But the people in power saying, no, you can Czechoslovakia, it doesn't really matter. Yes, it does. You're making a terrible mistake. Oh, I think he knows he's winning. I mean, his army it's adapted. 40% of the Russian state economy is now focused entirely on killing Ukrainians. And this is a criticism of Zelensky, a man I admire greatly, but he, like all human beings, he has made mistakes and he's got flaws. And essentially, there was an argument between him and General Zelensky. Zelensky said, we need a war economy and we need a war society. We need to really change the draft. And Zelensky, this is still a peace economy and it's a peace economy with a very big defense budget, but it's still a peace economy. Ukraine hasn't caught up with Russia. And that's also true in terms of the draft. There are too many rich young men in Kyiv and Odessa who are not in the army in a way that they were in the army during the Second World War in Britain. And that's not right. And it's not fair. And I think Zelensky was right about that. But it also goes, we're in the West. So, for example, the Challenger 2 tank, it's a good tank. The Russians call it, the Ukrainians call it the sniper tank. They like it. But we gave them 14. I mean, come on, that's not going to make any difference. And Jonathan, what's happened to the factory that made those Challenger 2 tanks? It's now a housing estate. We are dealing with a psychopath in Vladimir Putin who has seized a country full of people who still live in the long Soviet shadow, who are terrified of Stalin's secret police to this day. And this is a formidable enemy, and 40% of their state economy is dedicated to this war, and we're giving 2 or 3%. It's not enough. We've got to fix this problem, and at the moment we're failing. And in that regard, Putin is winning, and Ukraine and the West are losing. I mean, we're all at a kind of front. And there are word bombs and word drones out there and word bots, which can be pretty painful and certainly are very annoying to deal with. But yeah, we're not in a trench in the snow and in the east. We're really not. So, I mean, most of the time I ignore bots, in particular people who are just fabulously rude or um, or their punctuation and their grammar is bad. And it may be because they're pig ignorant, or it may be because they're actually not native English speakers, but they have, as I like to say, snow on their boots. But yes, every now and then there's somebody who actually sits in the comfortable West, earning a good living, who writes rubbish, and you just go, "Oh, come on, what are you doing this for? Why? What is the point? What is the point?" And there is no proper understanding of history or humanity or the suffering that ordinary and extraordinary Ukrainians are going through right now. Um, and and, um, uh, uh, and there are times when despite myself, despite my thick skin, I do get angry and I do get upset, and I think, oh, for God's sake, you people in Ukraine right now, it's cold out there, it's cold in London, but it's seriously cold in Ukraine. There's snow on the ground, and heating is because the Russians have been attacking the power grid. Then, then power and lights and heat are not a given for a whole chunk of Ukrainians, and and for people to scoff at it and not understand what's going on, I find it appalling. Well, but they're not in the great scheme of things. They're not very important. I know you're going to ask me about this, but actually, the important actor, perhaps the number one most important actor right now, is Donald Trump and what he's going to do. And I've been tossing and turning about this myself. In that, listen, Jonathan, it's absolutely true that the Obama and Biden legacy for Ukraine has been dismal. That they have not provided, they have been great with rhetoric, but they have not provided Ukraine with the weapons necessary to defeat the Russians. And let's remember that Russia has a population roughly what? Um, I'm bad at maths. Is it two-thirds or three times the size of Ukraine? The Russian population is doing what the ruble is doing. It's tanking, and that's quite funny. But no, there are more Russians than Ukrainians, and therefore, if we don't seriously help the Ukrainians with materiel, the French word for arms and ammunition and drones and guns and tanks and all those things, then slowly, little by little, the Ukrainians will lose. And by the way, that's what's happening now. Um, but it's little by little, and Ukraine is an enormous country. So it's still very possible for Ukraine to keep on fighting for a very, very long time. And therefore the Russians can be engaged at the moment in a sort of Pyrrhic victory. But if America intervenes and tips the scales on Russia's side, that will be a disaster. So it is the anxiety is, and this has been flagged up by people like my friend Christopher Steele, the former MI6 officer who wrote the Trump dossier, never meant to be in the public domain, but it was put there. And I believe that what Chris's sources said in that report is more or less true. That Trump is absolutely a classic target for Russian sex compromat. He is a sexaholic in the way that his brother Fred was an alcoholic, and Fred died of alcoholic poisoning. So the question is, have the Russians got something on Trump, which means he's under Putin's thumb? Now, the counter argument, which is being put forward by Trump's defenders, but also by others, including people in Ukraine, who must be uh, who want to look for some good news, and I have some sympathy for wanting to look for some good news. But anyway, let's look at it like this: The Trump's problem is he does not want Ukraine to be his version of Joe Biden's wretched defeat from Afghanistan. So the argument, and this actually fills me with optimism. The argument, or rather, it gives me optimism, doesn't fill me with optimism. But this argument is quite a good one, or rather, is a good one because it would be ruinous for America's prestige and for Trump's presidency if there is a terrible fresh retreat by the Ukrainians. They lose Kharkiv, for example. Now we're talking about something like 5 million more refugees, men, women, and children. Um, Men not of the fighting age, but certainly millions more women and children fleeing from the east and then coming to Europe. Some will end up in the United States, and that will be shaming. And it'll be our fault more than anyone else's because we haven't properly armed Ukraine. The Chinese will be watching. And such a defeat will lead China to muck about more in the South China Sea than it is already doing. And what it is doing there is extremely dangerous because they're creating fake shoals, which become fake islands, which become fake Chinese bases. And then they're saying, well, okay, we own the fish here. We own the land underneath the we own because we built fake islands. We now own the land underneath the sea, and this is to the massive detriment of its neighbours. So, so what? So what the optimists think about Trump is Trump can't let Russia succeed. The problem is that I don't think he's been paying proper attention to this problem, and that his, solution that he can stop the war in 24 hours only it's a nonsense claim because the Ukrainians aren't going to give in that time frame, nor do they have to, because although the Biden administration hasn't given them enough stuff, and Europe and Britain haven't given enough stuff, and we're not in a position to do so, and these are serious problems we've got. Nevertheless, Ukrainians have got enough land, enough territory, enough troops, and enough ammo for the time being to last for many, many months. But if Trump does two things, first of all and I don't know this for a fact, but the hryvnia, the Ukrainian currency, is pretty strong. It's dropped a little bit in relation to the pound because the pound's doing relatively better, still not as well as
Especially compared to the ruble.
yeah, 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 yeah. The ruble, folks, is tanking. Um, However, of course, the pound was so much stronger before Brexit. And every now and then, when I say let's not go there, no, let's go there. It was an idiotic piece of self-harm by us. But nevertheless, the hryvnia is pretty strong, in particular against the dollar. It stayed the same. Now, I suspect this is because of a kind of a submarine or subterranean, whichever phrase is right, um, propping up exercise by the Western powers. And I would imagine because the Americans have got more money, that they are principally responsible or they are helping the Ukrainian currency maintain its value. An easy cut for Trump to make, and he wants to do cuts, is to snip that. And then you have a big decline in the Ukrainian economy, and that causes a whole series of other disasters that flow from that. Secondly, he can say to the Ukrainians, do a deal with the Russians. And and essentially that is for peace, give up your de facto, if not your de jure, claims to Crimea and the eastern marches, Donetsk and Luhansk. Let me explain the difference between de facto and de jure. I apologize for using a bit of Latin, but I was quite good at it at school. I was extremely bad at everything else. Anyway, so de jure means by law, de facto by fact, pretty much. So what I'm saying is, it would be wrong and foolish, and I don't think it's on the cards for Ukraine to actually properly give up its sovereignty over Crimea and the eastern oblasts or counties, Donetsk and Lugansk. or Luhansk. But it can say de facto, okay, the Russians are there, the Russian army is there. We will live with a ceasefire where the border, the effective border, not the sovereign border, but the effective border is where our army stops and the Russian army starts. And so, but also we want to be able to join NATO so that our security, what we've got left, is secure. And I don't think Trump's going to give that to them. I was shortlisted for a wonderful Canadian Ukrainian literary award called the Peterson Award, and it happens once every 2 years, and it was for my book, Killer in the Kremlin. I didn't win, but I was shortlisted, and as a shortlistee, I won 5,000 Canadian dollars, which is better than a kick in the teeth.
Excellent
The,
author did win, though.
the,
Yaroslav Trofimov.
yes, who was our enemies will vanish. So, but the person who was the fantastic guest speaker was General Ben Hodges, and don't call me Ben, but he's a real gent, very funny actually, as generals go. But he was saying it was a big mistake for the Western powers to pull their troops out of Ukraine back in whenever it was December 21. This is before the big war started. And it was a bad signal. So because why shouldn't, for example, British and French soldiers and American soldiers too be teaching Ukrainian soldiers how to defend themselves in Ukraine? Now, I'm not saying in Donetsk or Luhansk Oblast, and you put them obviously in the west, pretty close to the western border. But you're making a point there. But you should also have them, I think, in Kyiv, in the capital, and you're making the point that NATO's not going to give its shield, its nuclear shield, to extend it to Ukraine. I can't see that happening. However, I do not think that Russia will ever seek to nuke Ukraine for a number of reasons. The first of which is the Chinese really don't want Russia to do that because if it does, it tanks the world economy. Secondly, Russia is winning or stronger militarily than Ukraine. So
Putin
why
believes he is anyway. That's the key thing. Putin seems to believe he's winning.
he is moving the board the military front line, not the military border, but the military front line is moving, unfortunately, in a westerly direction. Ukraine is losing places and it's losing people. Now, it's losing far fewer people, but it's got far fewer people to lose. And because it's a democracy, they care about the loss of lives in a way that Putin, because he's a psychopathic dictator, does not. So that is a big problem. However, um, if we've got boots on the ground, training boots, doesn't matter. It makes it much more difficult for the Russians. I think it rules out nuclear stuff, but I don't think they're going to do that. The other reason is one, China doesn't want it to do so because it'll tank the world economy, and the Chinese will kill Putin if they disobey him on this. Number two is that the wind blows from the west to east some of the time. You nuke Ukraine, you nuke, say, Kherson, then very quickly, Rostov-on-Don, Russia's one of Russia's maybe top 10 biggest cities, will be irradiated. So millions of Russians will be irradiated quite quickly because Ukraine sits next door to Russia. Number three, I actually don't think that the Russian machinery will let Putin do it. I mean, it's not just Putin pushing a button. You have to have a series of minions who also have to push buttons. And actually, weirdly, I don't think Russia is quite there for blowing up the world. I don't think that's going to happen. But if you have boots on the ground, and General Ben Hodges was suggesting this, you have trainers, people, British and French soldiers training Ukrainian soldiers, helping with the medical stuff, helping with logistics, um, not actively killing Russians, but helping stiffen and support the Ukrainian army. then it becomes harder for the Russians to bomb Ukraine willy-nilly because of that consequence. And this is something we can do, which is doable. Now, the problem for the Ukrainians and the problems for Trump's quotes negotiation is that he's asking the Ukrainians to give up a couple of serious cards, their right to, or rather their effective right to Crimea, their effective right to the Eastern Oblast and Luhansk, a chunk of the Dnipro, a chunk of the Kherson under, below the river, all of that stuff. You're asking the Ukrainians to give up this stuff, and for then the Russians to say that's fine, and then we'll stop. What happens? And this is the Yevgeny Prigozhin question. What happens if Trump breaks his, if Putin breaks his word? Forgive the Freudian slip. So, just to explain to folks, Prigozhin was the kind of gangster chef who actually becomes quite effective as a military commander and gets angry with the Russian Ministry of Defense because it doesn't deliver enough kit and stuff to him and his soldiers and the Wagner army. And eventually he becomes unruly. He gets so angry, he launches a bit of a coup d'etat, and the coup d'etat is stopped. There's some secret negotiation between him and Putin. He stops, and Prigozhin is allowed to live. And then a couple of months later, his plane and everybody on it, his key lieutenants, are blown out of the sky as a fireball. So if I was the Ukrainians, I would ask a simple question: how reliable is the word of the killer in the Kremlin? And the answer is not very. I don't want to, oh, hey, I'm going to go a bit saucy now. In some ways, this is about to become the war of Melania's tits. Now, you should put an ad at the front, viewer discretion is advised, but bear with me. On December the 6th, 60 Minutes, was whatever it's called in Russian, 60 Minutes, how do you say that?
No,
The
yes,
new,
60 minut, so
yeah,
something like
yeah,
that. Yeah, yeah.
which is the most watched current affairs show on the most watched channel, Russia One. Do an item, and they do it long, and it is about a 24-year-old porn shoot shot in GQ where you see the naked body of Melania Trump before she was Melania Trump. Now, why on earth did they do that? And this is effectively, basically, the first day Trump's won, and this is because of the time distance and so forth. This is the first day when Moscow TV, Kremlin TV, can reflect on Trump's victory, Trump too, and what they're doing is they're being incredibly rude, and salacious. And what's funny about Donald Trump is that he can fornicate with whoever he wishes to, as we know, Stormy Daniels, etc., etc., etc. But that's one thing. But if you're from Queens, his kind of slightly grubby part of New York where he was brought up, you really, really don't disrespect the wife. That doesn't go with the kind of sub-gangsterese mindset of Trump and his family. And um, and I thought it was a shocking display of one of Putin's tropes, sex compromat. Now remember, back in 1988, Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, the president, is a senile alcoholic. He's in serious trouble. This is the back end of his thing. He'd been a brave man at the start. It all gone badly, and his family, the Yeltsin family, were very corrupt. And there was an investigator, Russia's top cop, if you like, prosecutor general, a guy called Skaratov, and he's on the case of the Yeltsin family. Then suddenly a video appears of him in bed with two women prostitutes half his age. And Vladimir Putin, who is then the head of the FSB, secret policeman, actually goes on telly and says, "But the pictures are grainy, video is grainy." He said, "By the way, that is Skaratov." Moving forward in 2016, Mikhail Kasyanov was Putin's first prime minister, and he leaves the Kremlin in 2004, and then he becomes a bigger and bigger critic of his former boss. And by, I think it's 2016, he's a serious danger, and he's a former prime minister. Now, there are words about corruption and stuff like this, but essentially, as a serious establishment figure, his criticisms of Putin's increasing authoritarian rule are dangerous for Putin. And guess what? A video appears of him having sex with his lover. And I've spoken to her and I interviewed her for my book, Killer in the Kremlin. And I just feel very desperately sorry for them as human beings. But Putin likes doing this. So this is sex compromat. And my takeaway from, if you like, the war of Melania's tits is simple, is that this is a signal from the Kremlin to Trump. Obey. Because if you don't obey, then we've got more of this stuff. We're not talking about on Melania. We're talking about on you. So do as you're told. And if I'm Trump, I don't like that. Now, part of the weirdness of this is that Trump's kind of navigates the world, and this is what's so frightening about him becoming president, through the enmities of the people he hates the most. And probably the politician he hates the most in the whole world is Barack Obama. And Barack Obama was pro-Ukraine, and therefore Trump's anti-Ukraine. But actually, the narrative now is that Obama wasn't really pro-Ukraine. He said he was pro-Ukraine, but he wasn't really. So it's possible there is a new line of attack here that Trump will come to understand that neither Obama nor Biden really gave Ukraine what it really needed. And so that he can paint himself as the more true or the truer friend of Ukraine than the Democrat leaders. Now, listen, I don't want to overdo this because I don't want to overspin the new spin, and I'm skeptical. And for example, Philip O'Brien, who's a very, very good, he's really skeptical about this. But you've mentioned a couple of names. Let's have a look at them. The first is Rubio, who's tipped to be the Secretary of State. He is a kind of George Bush, kind of neocon in that camp. But actually coming with that is not wanting the authoritarian powers to succeed. And I'd prefer, anybody with half a mind, prefer that mindset to the MAGA mindset. So Rubio is good news. The question is, as a top diplomat, how much muscle has you really got compared to somebody like Elon Musk, who is horribly flaky about the killer in the Kremlin? So now remember, I mean, listen, I've been to Trump Tower. I interviewed Trump a couple, 3 times, or I met him 3 times. And I last interviewed him in 2013 about his relationship with a Russian-born gangster called Felix Sater, who ended up helping him with some dodgy deals in New York. And Trump didn't like my questioning. I said to Trump, why didn't you say to this guy, Felix Sater, you're connected with the mafia, you're fired? And Trump walked out on me. But not before I said, why did you buy your concrete from Fat Tony Salerno? Fat Tony was fat, as a great friends of mine, a great journalist called Wayne Barrett said. Now, the thing about Trump Tower, and you get it if you go there, is that Trump likes to have a series of underbosses who are all kind of knifing each other in the back and hating each other. There's something sort of dark and pathetic and depressing about Trump liking his underbosses knifing each other. And I think what we're looking at in terms of Trump 1 was like this, and the Trump 2 administration will be the same. So he'll get Rubio as the top diplomat, but also he'll be listening. The other day he called up Zelensky, and Elon Musk joined in the phone call. Like what the hell is going on? So, and that will obviously. I don't think that Rubio is a he. It's good that he's there, but I doubt whether he will have the serious chops in the regime that his title suggests. The second guy is Kellogg. Now, Kellogg is the former American general who was Mike Pence's deputy, sorry, national security spokesman. Remember, Pence is the vice president, and as I think LBJ said, the job isn't worth a bucket of warm piss. But Kellogg stood up to Trump a fair bit over the January 6th nonsense, and but the criticisms made of him is he's a bit jellyfish, he's a bit wishy-washy, so that although his rhetoric might be good, the worry is when it comes to the crunch, he won't truly stand up for Ukraine. So I mean, I think the honest, truthful answer to your broad question, what's Trump going to do, is I don't know. Yeah, but also I think the war of Melania's tits, as I keep on referring to it in my rather naughty way, indicates that the Kremlin don't know what to do either, or they don't know how it's going, and they're worried. The signal of showing Melania's nude photo shoot suggests that the Kremlin um, don't have a strong hold or as strong a if they had a stronghold over Trump, if they were completely confident, they wouldn't have to do that. They just sort of, America rejoices, and so people who listen to your podcast are clever, or watching this aren't stupid, but the Kremlin controls this show, like the Kremlin controls all the media. There's no way the journalists ran this stuff without Putin expressly telling them to do so. So this shows that the Kremlin doesn't know. Once again, the big picture is if Trump allows Russia to win bigly, as Trump would put it, then you're going to see 5 million more refugees, more possibly. I hope and pray that never happens, in Europe and in the States. And it will be embarrassing for American power. And secondly, but for the moment, the problem is the Russians they're kind of, they win two goodies, i.e., the Ukrainians give up their rights de facto to the eastern Crimea before the Russians really show their hand on the war. Now, where it becomes grimly fascinating is if Ukraine and they are in trouble and they're losing too many people and they're losing territory, if the Ukrainians, under the gun from the threat of America walking away from supplying ammo, supplying money to keep the war economy going. If the Ukrainians say, okay, for now, we accept, we can't join NATO, we will de facto, by fact, give up for now our claims to Ukraine and the Eastern Oblasts. And then Trump keeps on firing and keeps on marching west. It's going to be like 1918. I can't say. Oh, by the way, the guns may stop for a bit, but actually, it's not 1918. It's 1938. You give Putin, or do I mean Hitler, Czechoslovakia. I said, okay, that's the last territorial claim I've got. Thanks very much. And then bang, a year later, I want Poland too. I'm having it. So um, I so the question is this is if the Ukrainians do their side of the deal, okay, we accept for now the Russians are sitting in Crimea and the East. Okay. But the quid pro quo is the Russians stop. If they don't stop, carry on, will Trump then arm Ukraine properly? And that is, and I'd like to know the answer to that question. But if I was the British Prime Minister, and let's remind everybody that when I stood as a Liberal Democrat in Sutton Coldfield, I came fourth, but never mind. So I'm clearly not. But if I was, I'd be preparing for a future in which Europe and Britain have to make good the slack created by a Trump exit from Ukraine. So the worst scenario is that Trump, perhaps because they've got very damaging compromat. By the way, this isn't compromat for me on Trump is not him having sex with a 24-year-old woman. It's him not having sex with a 24-year-old woman, him being impotent and being embarrassingly shamed to be so, or him being violent or him being disgusting in some way. The Russians and Vladimir Putin in particular understand compromat. So if people are saying, oh, that's not going to bother Trump, oh, the Russians know their stuff in this.
Depends what they've got, isn't it? If it's plain old vanilla kind of stuff, that'll probably enhance his reputation,
Yeah,
but it's unlikely to be that.
exactly, because they understand it. This is an intelligence service, an entire national intelligence service, which has taken over a country. Um, so the interesting question, and it's one we don't know the answer to, is will Trump, through this kind of weird, he navigates the world, with his sextant, if you like, and it's that backward, is what didn't Obama do, etc. What didn't Biden do? I'll do the opposite. Or whatever they did, I'll do the opposite. That kind of thinking. But suddenly he's also now got to consider. I mean, imagine let's that he's the New York gang boss. It's the 30s, and he gets on very well with Al Capone because Al Capone stays in Chicago. And then suddenly Al Capone has been very rude about his wife. And although actually to take over New York, Trump, the gangster, has had a lot of fun monstering the other gang leaders inside New York. He's now gone up a grade, and it's him or Al Capone. And if he buckles, everybody will see that he's buckled, and they'll have consequences. The fall of Bashar al-Assad is a great moment for humanity, and it's a bad moment for Vladimir Putin. And what it shows actually is that the Ukrainians, although I've said that they're losing, but they are. It could well be possible that Russia is winning a Pyrrhic victory. So people don't know what the phrase means. He was a Roman. I think he was maybe a Roman or Carthaginian general. I can't remember, but he was a general whose victories were so bloody. He lost so many people. They were really a kind of defeat. And certainly what happened was at the critical moment, there are so few Russian soldiers left in Syria and Russian sailors, they weren't able to properly help defend the Assad regime. It collapsed because they're all in Ukraine fighting the Ukrainians. And that's a beautiful moment. Secondly, it makes Africa's adventures in the Sahel, and these are dangerous and frightening, but there's been about 8 coups d'etats in the Sahel countries, all of the places like Mali, if I'm right, all of these countries, which I've been to, they it makes it far harder for the Russians to resupply these countries because they've lost the ports in Syria, or they're in the process of losing. So but Assad's fall is a disaster for Putin. both in terms of public perception and also in terms of the game of risk he likes to play. Him mucking around in Africa becomes much harder. Him mucking around the Middle East, he's become a bit of an embarrassment. Secondly, the ruble is tanking, and this has a real world significance in that the tanking of the ruble means it makes it much harder for the Russians to buy stuff on the world market. So, for example, because the ruble is really weak, they're now having to pay a lot more of their treasure to the Chinese to buy drones. And that is a real problem. So rather than Putin being, a man he respects, the danger is that at this critical moment, a new American president could come in and say, okay, Putin, I don't like the way you disrespected my wife. I don't like the way you're you're pretending that you're the big boss and you're being rude about us. I can see what the Chinese are watching. So look at this, son. And then he sets out, the majesty of American power properly, and at the same time rebuilding and refreshing the American war supplies, which they could easily do. Yeah, so the neurotic anxiety of the Biden administration was they did not want a Ukrainian victory because Ukrainian victory would mean the exit of Putin and then the chaos that would follow from that. And what they feared was that Russia would be in Iraq 2.0. The problem with that is that rather than that happening, what we're now looking at is the possibility of a Russian victory, of Ukraine falling, and then if Ukraine falls or Ukraine is um, uh, cut in half, that's a possibility, by the way. Then the Chinese will muck around in the South China Sea, and the dictators will be on the front foot. So, this is it's a real hinge moment in our history that's coming up soon. Uh, and Jonathan, I don't know what's going to happen. Um, I'm I'm going to listen. I'm an optimist. And actually, General Ben Hodges in Toronto at this award do, he said, um, people who sit around a committee who sits down in a room being gloomy, have never done anything. So the optimistic version is that Trump sees he that to stand up for his own self-image and for the American economy and the American stock market and the things he cares about, he's actually got to stand up for American power and he's got to use it. And he can do all sorts of things well short of it. So the one simple example is it's only since after Trump won, that the Biden administration finally sanctioned Gazprom Bank, which is the main bank which Russia's biggest oil and gas company, Gazprom, trades. And suddenly the Russian economy has gone through the floor. It's in dire trouble because of that simple act. And I have to say to my Ukrainian friends who have suffered so much and lost so many of their friends, I'm so sorry that it's taken far, far too long for the Western democracies, and the most important is the American one, to act in an effective way. Yes, yes, yes. In the meantime, we can only hope that Ukraine gets it, that there are many, many people in the West, in the States too, in Europe and in Britain, across the whole world, who understand that nations should not be allowed to invade other nations and steal their land. And that is why my grandfathers fought in the First World War and my father fought in the Second World War. And all those people lost so many lives and so much blood was spilt to prevent this from ever happening again. And for Trump and the people around him to forget that would be an utter and absolute disgrace. But this is a disgrace which will come upon him in real time if he lets it happen. So I think what is quite possible is that he gets it wrong to begin with, and then as a consequence of his silliness and foolishness and shallow thinking is visited upon him, he course corrects.
Let's start with that idea of cynicism, because I think you have been consistent all along in saying that if Trump talks like a Russian asset and smells like a Russian asset, then he's a Russian asset. Now he is behaving to the benefit of the Kremlin. So is what he's doing something that was on your trajectory? Was it on your bingo card? Or are we in a darker place than you could have imagined?
I'm afraid to say that what's happening is darker. In particular, the betrayal that's in this morning's papers, which is that the United States has stopped sharing intelligence with the Ukrainians. There are two elements to this. The first of all is the offense. It makes it much more difficult for the Ukrainians to attack the Russians. And of course, in a war, part of successful defense is keeping the enemy on their toes, keeping them on the back foot, so that that's a serious problem. But the second part is Ukraine's ability to defend its cities from attack, and in particular the capital, Kyiv. So they're under constant drone attack, and then the drone numbers are going up. I can remember back in the day when Kyiv or Ukraine was hit with something like 15 Iranian Shahed drones, and there was a big thing. The numbers keep on going up. There's like 100 a night, and now we're hitting something like 200 drones a night. Then there's also the missiles. Now, American intelligence, this comes from satellites, spy satellites, etc., has been incredibly helpful for the Ukrainians in terms of them being able to deal with with the missiles in particular, but also the drones. The Americans have been telling them, watch out, these missiles are coming, they've been launched here. And so that makes Ukrainian air defense able to knock them out of the sky before they hit the big city, in particular Kyiv. But the critical thing is that this makes it much easier for the Russians to murder dozens and dozens, and then looking into the future, hundreds and then thousands of Ukrainian civilians. And then that in turn will cause a refugee panic if America doesn't change its mind. Now, Europe can help with some of this, but the problem is that we have, Britain is part of Europe, in my view. I am a Liberal Democrat and I make no apologies about that, but we don't have enough time to build up and these kind of air defense capabilities, because we always would rely upon the Americans. The British Army, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy can do lots of good things, but too much of Europe's defensive shield has been based on American stuff. Now, Trump has pulled the plug, ostensibly because he's not satisfied with the minerals deal that Ukraine was offering, and because President Zelensky was disrespectful when they met. Now, I watched that bullying with horror, and to be honest, Jonathan, it reminded me of when at the age of 10 we moved from Manchester to Hampshire. And I was bullied at primary school because I had a funny accent, and I felt I felt alone, and I had no friends, and it was very, very tough. And I can remember being bullied, and that's what exactly what that behavior was. And, the suit,
Yep.
he's not wearing a suit because Ukraine's under martial law and he's got a symbol. He wears what he does because everybody in Ukraine and the Ukrainian army is fighting for Ukraine and he's the president. So he doesn't have a gun, he doesn't go to the trenches, although he's gone pretty close to the front line on many, many occasions, good on him. But it's a symbol of his country under attack. And for the MAGA people to mock him for this is rude. And I was pleased to see our sweet king, invite him to his home in Sandringham. And the king, of course, was wearing a fancy suit, and he doesn't give a monkey's about what he was wearing. Really, I felt that the bullying was deliberate, and it was an attempt to humiliate Zelensky so that he had to stand up for himself. And the moment he stood up for himself, then he was in the wrong. What are you doing? Oh, well, I'm like, he's standing up for himself. He's standing up for his country. And Trump's saying things like, I think my favorite kickback from Zelensky was, it's because of me, because of the javelin, says Trump, you would have been finished within 2 weeks unless. And what's so horrible about that is it completely takes away what happened, which is that the Ukrainians were incredibly brave and they fought like tigers. And it wasn't Trump's gift of the javelins which bought them time, it was their courage. And anyway, so Trump said that, 2 weeks, and Zelensky goes, oh, yes, yeah, Putin talked about 3 days. And it felt, okay, so essentially, both the Russians and the Americans are on the same side now. And the Ukrainians are fighting 2 czars, not one. The Red Tsar, the Tsar in blood in Moscow, and the Orange Tsar, the Marmalade Tsar in Washington, D.C. Yeah, yes, I like the Marmalade Tsar, but anyway, the effective consequence of their actions is that if they carry on like this, thousands of Ukrainians will die really quite quickly. Now, the freeze in military supplies, that is also a terrible thing to do to the Ukrainians who are fighting for their lives, fighting an existential war. But the Ukrainians have got enough stocks that they can last till the summer, maybe 6 months, maybe longer. They're very tough before Europe can start catching up and arming. And all the sounds, to be fair, what the French and the British and the Germans are all saying, it's all good. That we just need time to get ourselves going, and we're in the right direction. But cutting the intelligence sharing helps the Russians in real time immediately. And the likely cost of this is going to be thousands and thousands and thousands of civilian lives. Ukrainian civilians will be looking at this and thinking, my kids, etc., were getting out. And so if Trump continues on this course, there is likely to be a massive, fresh Ukrainian refugee crisis. All of it Trump's fault. Does he care? The problem is that Zelensky is absolutely right, that Trump lives inside a disinformation bubble. But a bubble explodes, and then there's another bubble and another bubble and another bubble, and the people who are reporting all of this to his supporters and who voted Republican, who voted for Trump, are themselves effectively Russian assets. I'm talking about Fox TV, Newsmax, all of this. They're coming up with stories that Zelensky is the problem. No, Russia invaded Ukraine. And so what we're dealing with is a kind of dark fairy story. the Trump supporters believe that black is white and white is black. And Trump believes what he sees on his TV, and it's his stuff being relayed back to him. And there's nobody around him, it seems, who has the moral courage to say, this is wrong, boss. We shouldn't be doing this. He has been consistently derogatory of the Democrats for supporting Ukraine. Now, it was possible during the election last autumn to view Trump's position on Ukraine because Biden was supporting Ukraine. Then I'm going to attack Ukraine because I do the opposite of what Biden does. But the speed with which he is betraying Ukraine and the ferocity of the betrayal is such that it makes me think ink black thoughts are the right ones. That Trump is not just, he's not attacking or betraying Ukraine because Biden supported Ukraine. He's doing it because he's been mentally captured by the Kremlin. Now, there are the various elements of this. You can look at a Venn diagram or whatever. You've got bits and pieces. The big picture is, what are we looking at in terms of the effect of what he's doing? The effect of what he's doing is that that Ukraine could collapse within 6 months, possibly faster. And what you've got is an economic collapse, a social collapse, and a military collapse. Of the three, the military collapse is less likely because the Ukrainian army is good and brave, and they have enough bullets and stuff to keep them going for 6 months. But the Russians so much more. Hence the betrayal. One of my friends who's in the Ukrainian army was telling me just now, actually, that Toretsk is part of the Pokrovsk front, and the Russians are taking the decision, let's get Kursk back. And the Ukrainians are in trouble in Kursk. It's also true to say is that because of, both sides have got drones, the Russians have got many, many, many more drones, both the Shahed drones, which they're using to terrorize and attack civilians in Ukrainian cities, but also they have loads of these small first-person view battlefield drones, drones with wires on, etc., etc. They have many, many more drones than the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians are really good at their drone use. What it means is that it makes it much harder to attack because the other side can see what you're doing. And I think in January, Russia's losses were like 20% of their total losses during the entire 3 years. And the reason for that is because Putin was saying, get Pokrovsk and kick the Ukrainians out of Kursk. This is the little bit of Russia that Ukrainians have taken in the summer. Now, the Russians were unable to do either of those objectives. And they lost an awful lot of people doing that. And the fundamental reason for that is because, and General Zelensky, the former general, who is now Ukraine's ambassador to London, said is that the war is now a stalemate unless there is some new technological development. The problem with what the Americans are now doing is they are changing the stalemate in Russia's favor. But also, there are, as I said, there are three components. There's the social component, the economic component, and the military component. Ukraine has been doing very well militarily. Now they're being betrayed by the Americans. The same applies to the economy. The Americans and the Europeans have been with the Ukrainians money to prop up the hryvnia, so it's been stable for the whole 3 years. The money has been good. Now, what that means is that there isn't a nightmarish fight about inflation, about the devaluation of the Ukrainian currency, all of that. And because that makes fighting a war so much tougher. Now, again, if Trump some of this stuff is happening in the shadows, but I suspect that Trump will undermine the economic fronts and the economic war as well. Now, Europe can step up with that much faster, but it can provide military stuff. But then that's a big cost to Europe, and it's a kind of overnight cost. Now, yes, Europe is wrong. I never want Britain or our friends and allies in Europe ever to be in this situation again, where we depend on American goodwill to defend ourselves. This is a terrible mistake of national security, because suddenly in the White House we have a friend of the Kremlin, an enemy of everything we stand for, and this is catastrophic for us too. But the timescale, it's absolutely catastrophic now for Ukrainians. It's very, very bad for all of us soon. And the next thing is, if the Russians succeed more or less in Ukraine, then I can imagine, Estonia is 40% Russian, partly because the Russians move people to Estonia. It's a tiny country, but they're fighting for their. I can imagine there'll be Russian-generated trouble in Estonia next. We also know, you see real battles happening in Romania. At the moment, they're court battles against the TikTok Nazi who got more votes than everybody else because the Russians were helping him. So there is a real fear that Russian power and influence, it's not going to stop in Ukraine. It's going to carry on and carry on because Putin is like this. And then, by the way, and the third component is a social front, a social war, if you like. If Trump doesn't reverse, then you will have an economic collapse, a military collapse, and that will lead to a social collapse. And now, but there are versions of this where the collapse isn't complete, but nevertheless, so for example, the Dnipro is a very good barrier. But if the Russians come through Belarus and down, Belarus sits over the west bank of the Dnipro, so they lose that advantage too as well. Does Trump realize what he's doing? And the answer to that is no, because he lives inside a disinformation bubble. But both Macron and Starmer, and I would have thought some people inside the Pentagon and the CIA, the good people who are left, who haven't been beheaded professionally, will be pushing back. And then there's an issue it's not, we can't call it yet, because it's possible that Trump will reverse and change his mind. But what it looks though, it looks like the darkest chapters or passages of my book, Killer in the Kremlin, are right when I point out a story by, for example, former head of the Russian department at MI6, Christopher Steele, who's a friend of mine, in which he says that the Russians have got sex compromat on Donald Trump. By the way, I don't think that's the whole story. So I think there's that, but I also think there's economic compromat. And by the way, the sexual compromat won't be nice. So if some of your listeners are saying, oh, well, what's Trump to be embarrassed about? It'll be done. The Russian dark state is good at what they do. They know what they're doing, and they'll have something Trump doesn't like.
It's going to be kids or something horrific, right? It's going to be something terrible.
Or him not being able to. I don't think he's a paedophile, and there's no evidence that he was like Jeffrey Epstein. But for example, that he's having sex with a beautiful prostitute. He can't come because he's too old and knackered and fucked, and he assaults her. And you see the whole sequence. Or there's a story that there was a Russian beauty queen from this bizarre beauty queen nonsense, who was his girlfriend who lived in Trump Tower. She seemed to be pregnant, and then the pregnancy gone, so he paid for an abortion, and that could hurt him with the evangelicals. But I also think, when I said in broad brush that he's been mentally captured by the Kremlin, he likes the way Putin's has power, wields power, and is jealous. He'd like to be Putin, and that is so. I think it's very likely, more likely than not, that the Russians have got some compromat on him. Also, money compromat as well. Sex compromat, money compromat, but also the other thing, which is that Trump wants Putin to like him. Trump wants to go to Moscow. He wants to have to stand in the Kremlin and watch the Russian tanks go by. That there's blood on the tracks of those tanks doesn't seem to bother him at all. Now, I'm qualifying this because it's possible Trump will see that what he's doing is mad and bad and wrong, but we're not seeing it happen. We're not seeing that message get through yet. So the other source of qualified optimism is his mad, bad, and wrong economic policy, tariffs. All nationalism is wrong, and economic nationalism is even more stupid than normal nationalism, because you end up cutting off your nose to spite your face. And that's what he's doing. Sanctions against Canada, guess what? Canada's putting sanctions against the United States. Because of the weird way the US oil industry works, they actually buy a lot of Canadian oil because that's easier to process in their oil refineries than the stuff that's coming out of the ground from Saudi Arabia. So American oil refineries find it cheaper to buy Canadian oil. It's crazy what he's doing. And I think quite quickly, he will be compelled to reverse this process. I think that he will reverse the tariffs. He'll obviously, Trump being Trump, he'll blame somebody else. So it's possible that his, by the way, I think this economic boomerang is going to hit him faster than the political military boomerang from Ukraine. But a number of things are becoming obvious, one of which is that Rheinmetall's share price has gone up 49%, and American defense stock is tanking. By the way, the American defense companies are very good at lobbying, and there's a certain point at which, if you buy American and the Americans say, well, actually, you can't use that to defend Ukraine, then the signal goes out to everyone, don't buy American, because you can't bloody use it when you have to. And that is a terrible message. So the cost, the military and economic cost of Trump's Ukraine policy is terrible for the United States and terrible for the proper projection of American power. Essentially, he's selling the shop. He's selling the farm to the Russians for a bag of beans. And it's weird he doesn't see that. He keeps in penury and trauma. And the other thing, the reason I love democracy and hate dictatorship is because dictatorship is so boring. I mean, I've spent not my whole life or anything like it, but I spent quite a bit of my life going to places like Zimbabwe, or China, and there are no interesting books in these places. Also, Castro's Cuba too, as well. The Soviet, there are, and the other thing is that Biden was too weak and too timid and didn't give the Ukrainians enough stuff in a proper fashion. And he will go down in history as the man who failed the Ukrainians, but not the man who betrayed the Ukrainians. That's Donald Trump, or rather Vladimir Trump, as we should now call him. But at least under Biden, you didn't have this horrible thing of every morning of waking up to hear the latest crime of Donald Trump. And part of this awfulness of dictatorship is it invades your headspace. I like democracy because I know that there are checks and balances with the Prime Minister, and, for example, ours, and I know that under Rishi Sunak and now under Keir Starmer, they are essentially reasonable human beings who were in power due to whose use of power is trammeled by a series of checks and balances, which we've developed over time, over the centuries through history, which makes democracy so much better than dictatorship. Trump's an effective TikTok dictator now in the United States. We'll see just how robust the things are, but that's what it feels like. And part of what dictators do is they bore you stupid. So you kind of want to, I'm a huge fan of, great supporter of Ukraine, but it's all I do. I write books about. I'm writing a novel about the Battle of Kyiv. I'm thinking about all sorts of other projects, and part of me wants to unplug. I don't want to keep on thinking about Trump anymore. In a democracy, you can do that. In something that feels like a dictatorship, which is what America feels like right now, you can't. So what's so awful for the Ukrainians is they're living inside Donald Trump's madness. It's like being trapped inside somebody else's schizophrenia or paranoid insecurity. While he's accusing them of disrespect, while he is aiding and abetting the enemy, which is murdering their people. I mean, how dark can it get, mate? He's got a problem in that he's not going to enjoy his state visit if that happens, if he does that. So right now, Starmer and Macron are doing their level best to get through to Trump to say, stop doing this, is wrong. And the number one head of the list is the intelligence sharing. Carry on doing that. What are you doing? You want Ukraine to lose? Now, and I don't, the problem is that Trump is unpredictable, and I don't want to exclude the possibility completely that he will reverse his project and start and begin to accept, yes, Zelensky's got his own difficulties too, and therefore he can he helps Ukraine and reverses
It
his
does not
position.
seem probable at this point, though. I have to interject.
No, I'm just setting that out because I don't want to say definitively um, what I think is going to happen will happen. So everybody who's listening can get the point that this is not what I'm about to predict is not a fact, and Trump may reverse because he is unpredictable. Having said that, I think actually Trump is more predictable than not. He said he doesn't support Ukraine. His pick for vice president. The vice president, J.D. Vance, is a creeping creature that creepeth upon the face of the earth, who should be flattened. And instead, Trump gave him permission to be grossly bullying towards Zelensky. And Vance has got previous saying, I don't care about Ukraine. Now, why should you care about Ukraine is because both my grandfathers fought in the First World War, and my father fought in the Second World War for a simple principle that it is wrong for a nation to invade another nation and hope to steal their land. This is wrong. And that principle has meant that of course there's been wars, of course there's been exceptions, but the general point is that we have lived, certainly in Europe, with peace and prosperity since 45, because everybody gets that principle. And as time has gone on, fewer and fewer countries have sought to invade other countries. This is part of the 21st century, the modern world. And Trump and the Russians are going backwards on that. And it seems that Trump wants to reward the Russians for their military aggression, not punish them. And therefore, this is his logic. And essentially, it is, how can I best help the Kremlin? How can I best help Russia? And that would be to scrap the oil cap, scrap Russian sanctions, and the problem for Europe is the moment America starts trading with Russia, starts buying Russian oil, then European sanctions collapse because there is no united front. So, for the moment, things are dark, and it feels like they're getting darker and darker and darker. A couple of thoughts to mitigate this gloom. The first of which is America is the richest and most powerful country on earth, but the 21st century, and the world's always been like this, the world is a very, very, very interconnected place. People like Alexander Dugin, who wrote this script a long time ago, the first thing we need to do is split Britain from Europe. Brexit, thank you, Nigel Farage. Then to split Europe from the United States, that's happening in real time. And then you, rather than getting a world where you've got the West versus the East, democracy versus tyranny, you now have a series of weak liberal states fighting two or three tremendous autocratic giants. And those autocratic giants right now are Putin's Russia, Xi's China, and Trump's United States. And the little fish can go hang. That feels to be Trump's worldview. And he says lots of stuff. He is more predictable than not. He's in favor of all of that. But he doesn't understand that the world is a much more complicated place than it. So, for example, he does economic autarky against the Canadians will fight back. He does economic autarky against the Danes because of Greenland, then Europe will fight back. I mean, today on Twitter this morning, I'm so appalled by the failure by the Americans stop sharing intelligence that I've called for a boycott of American goods. Now, as best as one can, but for example, I do love a rum and coke. Well, from now on, it's going to be neat rum, whatever, but no Coke, thank you. I don't need to drink Coca-Cola. I can find other things to do, other drinks to drink. I'm going to start, very happily not go to McDonald's or KFC. These are simple things we can all do, and say so because we need to puncture the information bubble or the disinformation bubble that surrounds Donald Trump. The problem is, if that diagnosis is actually too mild, then actually Trump's disinformation bubble is a mask, and behind that mask is somebody who is a creature of Vladimir Putin. You've got to give, if Trump's going to change his mind in reverse, you don't want to lose that possibility, because all of the good things we need to do to help Ukraine are going to cost us an awful lot of money. So the best and cheapest solution for everything is for Trump to reverse. But we can't keep on hoping for him to play nice while he continues to stab Ukraine in the back with a fresh dagger every morning. We can't allow that to happen. So there's a certain, and I understand, by the way, when Starmer says, "Oh, I've got a letter from the king, please come to on a state visit." I understand what's going on there. I understand what Macron's trying to do, but it looked as though Trump got Macron to come over, and more or less, Macron was clever and stood up to him well, and Starmer was not bad either. But basically, more or less, you got a sense of France and Britain doffing their caps to Trump's power, showing that they were barons who owed fealty towards Trump. And there were some disagreements, but that's the general drift. The moment they go home, Zelensky sent him to the royal presence, and King Donald fucks him every which way. And the problem is that Britain and France has already said, have already played too nicely with this man. The question is, apparently, the stories in the papers, what's going to happen next is Zelensky's going to go back, sign the deal, but this time with Starmer and Macron holding hands. And I'm not sure that Trump will let that happen, because he doesn't want that to happen. So there's a certain point at which Britain and France's hopes of getting Trump to reverse, there's got to be a clock on that. Now, I would say a week, and then they should reverse the decision not to share intelligence with Ukrainians. That's critical. And if it carries on for longer than a week, then I think we're looking at Trump being captured by the Kremlin, because that's what all the evidence points in that direction. And I think the British and French hopes of turning Trump around are turning into folly, and then we should go for it. So, for example, there's something like $200 billion worth of Russian state gold in European banks. Now, and there is a downside to doing this, which is that there are people who say you've got to respect sovereign money. If you don't respect sovereign money, then they could steal our money down the track. And that is why we're not doing that. It's why we're not taking this dark Russian gold and giving it to the Ukrainians so they can defend themselves properly. I want to say to people who are worried about protecting sovereign money, what scenario do you envisage when you think, okay, actually the risk of not doing this is greater than the risk of protecting the notion of state sovereign money? because right now we're about to see, if things carry on in this pro-Kremlin direction, we're about to see the collapse of Ukraine, a fresh refugee crisis, which is all our fault, and then enormous pressure on the Baltics and the southern European states, because Russia is like that. Essentially, what's happening here is a recreation of Stalin's Soviet Union in the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 as designed by Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Those are the borders that Putin's aiming for. He wants that back. So I'm going to say to the people who protect state sovereign money, are you out of your fucking tiny minds? Hand over the money. And what we do is we give it to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians they develop their own defense business, and they're doing very well, it's said, but also they buy European and British defense stuff. And by the way, that helps us get out of the recession that Donald Trump is causing because of his fucking tariffs. So it's a win-win. Do it now. Yes, that would be beautiful if the by the way, I've been on holiday to Norway. It's beautiful. Everybody must go. And while everybody's there, you say, you've got to help the Ukrainians. The new German chancellor, that's a ray of sunshine after a lot of gloom. So there's a series of frankly silly locks on the German economy and its ability to spend money when necessary. And right now, and Merz, the new chancellor, has said, I'm shooting the locks off the treasure chest. We need to open it. We need to spend serious money. Again, Germany's in trouble in part because of Chinese electric cars and the electric car revolution, led, of course, by the openly neo-Nazi supporting Elon Musk. And again, this is virtuous, i.e., the Germans get to do some proper Keynesian economics and spend money on their defenses and help Ukraine with their defenses. So we should do that. We should, if the Russians get closer to the Dnipro, we should send boots on the ground, not onto the front line, but we should put British and French troops into Ukraine to train the Ukrainian army and to do all sorts of things, non-lethal, but for example, the medical stuff. If we did that, it helps the Ukrainian. What it does is we're doing a lot of the medical stuff, which and a lot of the support stuff. So we're helping them. So that and the Russians are aware of that. I.e., there is a line they should not cross because they're going to start hitting. This is an organization which is NATO less the Americans. But and I think the issue is it's down to this: is it's right and proper to give Trump a bit of time to reverse his pro-Kremlin madness. It's wrong for that clock to run and run and run and us do nothing. So there's a certain point where we, the British and the French, have got to say to the Americans, share the intelligence with Ukraine. If you're not going to do that, then we're out and we're going to rebuild a new architecture which keeps Europe at least safe and strong. And you, America, have lost a ton of good allies. And the idea that you can trust Vladimir Putin as a friend, well, that's beyond foolish. So Chamberlain was infinitely better than Trump. But what he made a series of catastrophic mistakes. But when the Nazis, having got Sudetenland, they then betrayed the Munich deal and then took the rest of Czechoslovakia. Then Chamberlain sort of said, right, let's build some more Spitfires. We're at that moment right now. We should be doing that right now. And we need to stand up to our and to the Americans and say, no, this is not good. Boycott American goods because of Trump. I mean, I spent my entire life admiring so much of America. And right now I feel disgusted and betrayed. And I feel disgusted and betrayed and afraid for my Ukrainian friends. And I want to say to the Americans who support Trump, you are mad. You're mad to trust Trump. You're mad and cruel and wrong to abandon the Ukrainians. Stop it. And if you don't stop it, then we will rebuild at least our part of the world without you. And we will not forget your betrayal and your treachery and your disgraceful conduct at this dark hour.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who supported the channel through 2025 and all those, of course, who are contemplating supporting us in 2026. We've run many events on the ground in the UK, Europe, and indeed in Ukraine as well. And some of the images of those events are on the screen as you see this. Your assistance has been absolutely invaluable to making it happen. And in 2026, we won't be able to do this scale of activity, have this impact, or even think about having these ambitions without your help and support. There are many ways you can help. Of course, liking, subscribing, making sure you are actually subscribed to the channel, because sometimes YouTube seems to kick people off their subscriptions unexpectedly, but actually also adding comments and sharing materials around your network. It all has a tremendous impact. Now, I know many people watching this channel contribute to Ukrainian charities and do what they can, but aren't necessarily people of huge means. But if you can, if you're able to, and if you see value in this work, please do contribute if you can. We have links to Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and even GoFundMe. That is all in the description of the video. Any support you can give will make sure that we can have not just the same level of impact this year as we did last year, but we can actually increase it. And the aim, in fact, is to double our impact this year, to go from reaching about 1.5 million people per month with our content, doubling that to 3 million, and also doing many more events to help support Ukraine, help support the concept of democracy and resilience. And as we know, 2026 is turning out to be even more dangerous than 2025 was, and the existential threat to democracy, freedom, Ukraine, those aligned with Ukraine, is greater now, perhaps, than it has been at any time since the full-scale war. Thank you for listening to this. Thank you for all of your support.